the prisoner who confessed to a crime he never knew. After 100 days of sleep deprivation, they brought him into a cold cell on the second floor of the old building, a place where the paint peeled from the walls like old skin, and the ceiling flickered with one dying light bulb that buzzed constantly like a fly trapped in a jar. His name was Elias Vane, a man with no criminal record, no outstanding debts, and no memory of what happened on the night of June 3rd. That night, when someone butchered a family of four in a quiet neighborhood where he just happened to be seen walking past. They didn't charge him at first. They said they were holding him for questioning. They gave him a paper cup of lukewarm water, took his belt, his watch, even his shoelaces. They asked questions, the same ones over and over again, as if they were scraping the bottom of his brain for something he didn't know was there. After the third day without sleep, Elias began to lose track of time. The room they put him in had no windows, and they never let him sleep more than 10 minutes at a time. Every time his body began to shut down, the door would crash open, flooding his cell with harsh fluorescent light. They would drag him into the next room, ask him the same questions, word for word. Always calm, always patient. They never struck him, never shouted. That would have made them the villains. They just kept him awake. They showed him photos, horrifying images of the crime scene, blood smeared on the walls, a baby's crib overturned, a mother's eyes still open. They told him where the wounds were, described the pattern of the stab marks. They said the killer used a specific type of knife and produced one just like it from a plastic evidence bag. Elias had never seen that knife before. He said so, but the longer he stared at it, the more he began to question himself. By the 10th day, his hand began to shake. His lips were cracked, his voice a hoarse rasp. They fed him just enough to keep him conscious. Crackers, a plastic spoonful of something beige. He began to hallucinate. Dark shapes in the corners of the room, whispers that grew louder as he tried to sleep. The ceiling tiles began to pulse like they were breathing. On the 15th day, they stopped asking questions. They just sat across from him in silence, watching. Sometimes one of them would yawn, loudly, theatrically, as if mocking his exhaustion. Once, they placed a mattress in front of him and let him look at it for 5 full minutes before pulling it away. His thoughts became fragmented. Time folded. He wasn't sure if it was day or night. He forgot where he was born. He forgot his sister's name. Sometimes he saw his mother in the corner, sitting cross-legged and humming a lullaby she used to sing when he had nightmares. He asked her what he had done, but she never answered. She just smiled. On the 30th day, Elias cried for 6 straight hours. No one stopped him. He begged to be allowed to sleep. He promised to tell them everything. Even though he still didn't know what everything was, they didn't react. They simply wrote something down on a clipboard and left the room. By day 40, he started confessing to things. Small things at first. He said he'd stolen a candy bar when he was 7, that he'd cheated on a test in school. He confessed to thoughts he wasn't even sure he had. Dark, shameful fantasies. He confessed to wishing someone dead once. It felt good, like he was bleeding poison out through his mouth. They smiled for the first time on day 42. They handed him a piece of paper with a full confession typed on it. Every detail matched the crime, the time, the location, the angle of the wounds. There was even a line describing how the baby gurgled as its neck was slit. Elias dropped the paper and backed into the wall, muttering that he couldn't have written it, that he didn't remember, that none of it made sense. Memory is a tricky thing, they said, especially when you're not sure what's real anymore. On day 50, they let him sleep. He collapsed into the cot, sobbing as his head hit the pillow. But the dreams were worse than the waking hours. He saw himself in that house, standing over the crib. He heard the screams. He smelled blood. The dreams were so vivid, so real, that when he woke up he vomited into the metal sink. He asked to see the confession again. By day 75, Elias could recite the confession word for word. He began to believe it. They let him walk into the interrogation room, unshackled. He was calm now, pliable. They praised him for being brave, for facing what he had done. They told him how rare it was to see someone truly repent. They even shook his hand. By day 90, he gave an official recorded statement. In his own words, He wept as he described the killings. He invented motives, said he felt rage, jealousy, a sudden urge to destroy. None of it was true, but that didn't matter anymore. Truth had dissolved like sugar in water. All that mattered was sleep. When the trial began, his confession was the centerpiece. The prosecution painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man, tormented by his own darkness. Elias sat in the courtroom like a ghost, nodding along. The defense tried to argue coercion, but there was no footage of abuse, no marks on his body, just long hours and a document signed in his own hand. They sentenced him to life in a maximum security prison. No possibility of parole. The families cried. The press called it justice. Elias smiled as they led him away. He had no idea what he'd done, but at least he would finally be allowed to sleep. 3 years later, the real killer confessed on his deathbed. He gave specific details only the murderer could know. He even produced a real murder weapon, with prints matching the crime scene. Investigators scrambled. The prison warden brought Elias into his office, pale-faced and shaking. Elias blinked slowly when they told him. "But I already confessed," he said. "You didn't do it," the warden replied. "You were broken. They never let you sleep. They pushed you until you cracked." Elias tilted his head. "But I remember it. I see it every night. You were tortured." Elias looked out the window, where sunlight poured through for the first time in years. He didn't seem angry. He didn't even seem surprised. "I think I liked it better when I thought I was guilty," he whispered. He declined release, chose to stay, because in the dark, in the quiet of his cell, the only thing he had left was sleep, and the dream that he had done something terrible. And somehow, that was easier than waking up. They let him go, technically. The legal system corrected itself like a machine that had realized a misfire. Paper signed, public apologies issued, a press conference held with solemn faces and phrases like tragic miscarriage of justice, and reforms must be made. They shook his hand again, this time in shame. They told him he was free. But Elias didn't walk out of prison gates. He walked into a psychiatric ward instead. He asked for it. No restraints. No court order. Just a quiet request on lined paper, written in block letters that trembled with each pen stroke. "I don't want to be outside. Please don't make me go." The doctors, they were kind. They offered him tea. Let him choose the color of his sheets. He chose gray. The same color as the walls in his old cell. His room had a window now, and they praised him when he opened on his own. But every time he slept, he saw the same dream. His hands slick with blood, his breath fogging up a baby's face as it went still. Sometimes, in the middle of group therapy, he would whisper details no one had asked for. The mother tried to crawl. Even without fingers, she tried. The room would go silent. Someone would say, "But you didn't do it." And Elias would nod, but he would always follow it with a hollow laugh and say, "Doesn't mean I didn't see it." Because the truth was, somewhere between day 50 and day 75, the lie had grown roots. It had sunk into his bones, into the quiet places in his mind that once held real memories. He could no longer remember the name of the girl he once loved, but he remembered the knife, the angle, the pressure, the scream that gurgled halfway through a syllable and never finished. He even remembered his face in the mirror afterward. Blank, calm, the face they described, the one from the phantom footage that never existed. The doctors tried to deconstruct it, to dig the truth back out. They called it identity displacement trauma and confession-induced psychosis. Some called him a case study, others a cautionary tale. One night, a young intern sat with him during observation. She was kind, too kind. "You know you didn't do it, Elias," she said softly. He didn't answer. He was watching his reflection in the window. The way the shadows warped his features made his face look like it was melting. He didn't blink. "You were innocent. We all know that now." Elias turned his head slowly, deliberately. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. "I kill them every night in my dreams," he whispered. "If you do it enough in your head, your hands start to feel it." The intern didn't know what to say. He leaned closer. "They made me forget who I was, so I became who they said I was. And now, He paused. Now I can't tell which version of me is the ghost. They increased his medication after that, gave him less time alone, more supervised activities. They even let him paint. He painted the same room every time. 4 walls, 1 door, 1 flickering light bulb, and a mattress stained at the edges. Always from the same perspective, as if viewed from the corner of the ceiling, like an invisible eye watching him sleep. He never painted the bodies, but he always included the knife, placed neatly on the floor, right next to where the light hit. Visitors came sometimes. Human rights lawyers, psych students, journalists. One asked him if he had forgiven the officers who had broken him. "I don't think they meant to," he said. "I think they just got tired of waiting." Another asked him what he would say to the real killer if given the chance. Elias smiled. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile in years. It was small, uneven, and deeply sad. I'd asked if he ever dreams of it too. They said they'd found a place for him outside, a small cottage in a recovery community with gardens and cats and warm meals. He thanked them, but he declined. "This is my sentence," he told the director. "I just happen to be serving it in a place with softer walls." They nodded. What else could they do? They didn't tell him when the officers who interrogated him were investigated. 2 were suspended. 1 resigned. 1 had a breakdown of his own, insisting he could still hear Elias whispering through the speakers even now. The audio tapes had all mysteriously vanished. The logs had gaps. No proof, just the results. Elias remained where he was, not because he had to, but because he couldn't go back to being a man who had never done something so monstrous. He no longer trusted that version of himself. He no longer believed in innocence, not when a mind could be hollowed out and filled with someone else's nightmare. Sometimes he would stand at the window, stare at the sky, and murmur to no one, "If they ever let me sleep again, what else did they let in?" Years passed. No one said his name in the papers anymore. No one remembered the headlines. But in a quiet room on the 2nd floor of psychiatric wing, a man still dreamed every night of blood, of a baby's cry, of a crime he never committed, but would always remember. It was his hands that gave him away more than anything else. Even though the doctors never saw him harm a soul, even though he kept his fingernails trimmed and his touch gentle when tending to the clinic's potted plants, Elias kept looking at his hands like they weren't his. He'd turn them over slowly in his lap, as if expecting to find something etched in the palms. Sometimes he would scrub them with soap until his knuckles bled, mumbling that they still felt warm. A new nurse once asked him what he meant. Elias looked up from the sink and whispered, "I think they remember what I forgot." He didn't scream. Not once in all the years he was there. Even when the dreams left him gasping, even when the nurses had to shake him awake because he was clawing at the walls in his sleep, he never raised his voice. Screaming was for people who still believed in relief. Elias only asked one thing of the staff: never let him sleep too long. At most, a few hours at a time. Any more than that, and the dreams became too real. Not just flashes, but full hours, full timelines. Entire nights relived where he could smell the blood dry in the carpet and feel the weight of the blade that never touched his fingers. He told one psychiatrist, during a rare moment of clarity, "They didn't just make me confess, they gave me someone else's life, someone else's death, and now he lives here with me every time I blink." The psychiatrist asked if he felt guilt. Elias shook his head. "I feel like a thief, not of life, of memory." There were records. Meticulously kept notes on his condition, his progress, his decline. Some described him as cooperative, others as quietly disturbed. A few doctors wrote that they feared he'd internalized a trauma too deeply to ever truly recover. One said bluntly, "He is a man who was punished into being someone else." Still, there were days, brief, flickering days, when Elias would hum to himself. Old songs, ones he couldn't quite name. On those days, he'd take his meals outside, stare at the sky for hours and smile at nothing. But the staff knew better than to think he was healed. Because every single time, before going back inside, Elias would stop in the corridor and ask in a low voice, "Did they ever find the knife again? And then, did they ever test it for my fingerprints? And finally, are you sure I didn't do it?" Even though he knew, even though it had been proven, even though he had been exonerated, doubt had become his religion. One winter night, the head nurse found Elias sitting on the floor of his room, legs crossed, eyes open, hands resting gently in his lap. A cup of tea sat beside him, untouched and cold. The light above him buzzed like an old interrogation bow, casting sharp shadows across the room. She knelt beside him. "You didn't sleep," she said. Elias smiled faintly. "No. Why not?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen too many false realities. "Because I'm afraid one day I'll dream something new, and I won't know if it's mine." The nurse touched his shoulder. He flinched. She tried again. "Elias, you're safe now." He nodded, but his voice was distant when he said, "That's what they told me the day they started breaking me." Outside, the snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling the world in white silence. Inside, Elias finally lay back on the bed, not to sleep, but to listen to the hum of the light, the pulse in his neck, the invisible ticking of memories he didn't trust. He folded his hands across his chest, like a man waiting to be buried, and as he stared at the ceiling, he whispered the same sentence he had whispered for years, as both penance and prayer. "I remember what I didn't do, and I will never forget it." Because memory, when twisted by pain, doesn't need truth to grow roots. It only needs time, and Elias had more than enough of that now. Years passed, and the hospital changed around him. New staff came, unfamiliar footsteps echoed in the halls, and the furniture was replaced with softer colors to make the place feel less like a prison. The medicine changed. The therapy programs modernized. The wing he lived in was renamed after a donor who had never stepped foot in it. But Elias stayed. He grew older in that room, his back curling slightly, his beard growing thin and white like spider silk. His voice faded to a low rasp, but his eyes never changed. Still watchful, still wide, still full of something too large to name. Visitors became rare. Even his file, once stamped and flagged and passed between experts like a hot stone, began collecting dust. No more reporters, no more lawsuits, no more curious students asking for interviews. Just him and the man in his head, because somewhere along the line, Elias had split. Not dramatically, not in the way movies portray with shouting and violence. It was quieter than that, a subtle division. He began speaking to someone no one else could see. Sometimes, he called him Elias, like the name belonged to someone else now. Other times, he called him or the other. Once, during a late-night observation, a nurse overheard him speaking softly in the dark. "Why did you do it?" Elias asked, then silence. "I don't remember picking up the knife, but I felt the handle." Another pause. "I didn't want to, but you made me need to. That's not the same, is it?" The nurse entered the room. "Elias, who are you talking to?" Elias smiled gently, to the part of me that never existed until they needed someone to blame. Some believed he was acting, a performance, maybe rooted in some subconscious need to remain a victim, to never move on. But others knew better. They saw it in his mannerisms, in the way he navigated the halls like someone forever waiting to be yanked back into an interrogation room. They saw it in his sleep, how he would jolt awake gasping, flailing, hands curled into fists, and whisper over and over, I didn't. Then one night, the dreaming stopped. He went still, 3 days without stirring. No dreams, no screams, just stillness. The doctors worried. Ran tests, found nothing. No stroke, no coma, no neurological explanation. He was conscious, alert, eyes open, breathing, but unresponsive, as if the mind had receded into some chamber far beneath the reach of their tools. Until he spoke. It was the night nurse again, the same one who had been with him for over a decade. She sat beside him, reading from his journal, the one he no longer wrote in but used to carry everywhere, pages crammed with half-thoughts and contradictory memories. She read aloud, half to comfort him, half to comfort herself. Then Elias blinked slowly and said, in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own, he confessed again last night, but this time he added something. The nurse paused, Who did? The man who lives where my name used to be. She set the book down carefully. What did he add? Elias turned his head slowly, his face illuminated by the pale blue nightlight. He said, he remembers doing it, but not why. And that's worse than not remembering at all, isn't it? She didn't answer, because she didn't know what was worse anymore. That same week, Elias wrote one final note, a short one, just 6 words. He folded it and placed it under his pillow. I was innocent, but now I'm not. They found him the next morning, peaceful, eyes closed, smiling, as if he had finally dreamed a version of the story where none of it had happened, or perhaps where he had done it, accepted it, and could finally let the war inside him end. They cremated him quietly. No family claimed the ashes. No headline followed. Just a man who once confessed to a crime he never knew, then lived long enough to believe it. And in some room, in some whisper of memory that still echoes the bones of that hospital, the question remains, how long does it take to forget who you really are when everyone is telling you who you must have been? Long enough to sleep, long enough to dream, long enough to wake up and never trust what you see again. Months after Elias's cremation, the hospital packed up his few belongings. A gray sweater, worn thin at the cuffs, a journal with the last 10 pages torn out, a half-used bar of soap still resting in a wooden box he carved himself during occupational therapy, with notches along its side, exactly 100, one for each day they had kept him awake. No one knew what to do with his ashes. The staff discussed scattering them in the guard garden, the place where he sometimes sat humming to himself. But an older nurse shook her head. He never looked comfortable out there. Too bright, too open. He always seemed afraid the sky would swallow him. They ended up placing the urn in the quietest corner of the hospital's memorial wall. No plaque, just his initials, EV, and yet something lingered. Strange things began happening in the ward where Elias had stayed. The nightlight in his old room began to flicker again, even though it had been replaced. The staff started hearing the buzz of a fluorescent bulb, but no bulb in the hospital made that exact sound anymore. Patients reported dreams of knives, of blank rooms, of voices asking questions that had no answers. One new patient, just transferred from another facility, woke up screaming one night. He didn't know who Elias was, had never met him, but he described the dream in perfect detail. A room with peeling walls, a single mattress, and a man asking over and over, "Do you remember now?" Then came the incident with the intern. He had been reviewing archive case notes late one night. Curiosity, mostly. He'd heard the rumors about Elias, the man who confessed without memory, lived without truth, and died without peace. He thought it would be an interesting study in coercive psychology, but halfway through the notes, he started to cry. Not out of emotion, out of panic, because he couldn't remember his own name for a full 20 minutes. He kept reading a line in Elias's file over and over again. After enough time without sleep, the mind will cling to any reality, even one that hurts. That night, he dreamed of a cold metal table, and a voice, his own voice, saying, "I'm ready to confess." One by one, the doctors stopped discussing Elias. The journal was sealed in archives. His old room remained unoccupied, not out of fear, but out of kind of unspoken respect. As though any new patient place there might inherit not just a space, but the weight. But something did remain in that room. Late at night, when the halls were empty and the lights dimmed low, the security feed from room 212 would sometimes flicker, and for just a few seconds, a figure could be seen sitting in the corner, cross-legged, eyes wide, hands folded in his lap, staring, not at the camera, but at something just out of frame, something only he could see. The hospital never acknowledged it, never investigated, never confirmed whether the figure matched Elias's shape, or whether the light in that room still buzzed in a rhythm, not found anywhere else in the building. But sometimes new patients, the ones still fragile, still unsure what was real and what was imagined, would pass the door to room 212 and pause. They'd press their hand gently to the wood and whisper, as if something on the other side might answer, "Do I remember now?" And on very rare nights, only when stars were hidden and the building was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. They swore they heard a voice respond. Not loud, not angry, just tired. So tired. Yes, now try to forget. They eventually sealed room 212. Not with ceremony, but with quiet intention. A new door was installed, but it remained locked. The number plate was removed. In the hospital's official floor plans, the room simply ceased to exist. Staff stopped walking that hallway at night. Patients were no longer housed nearby. And still, even with the room empty, the flickering light could sometimes be seen glowing faintly beneath the door, though the power had long since been cut. In time, new doctors came. The older nurses retired. The building changed hands, remodeled and rebranded. The records were boxed and buried in archives that no one opened anymore. Elias Vane became a cautionary footnote in a dusty medical journal. But some stories don't end just because no one tells them. Sometimes in the deepest part of night, when the air hangs thick and silence hums, someone walking past that hallway might hear it. A slow, rhythmic voice speaking words no one should still remember. A confession that loops over and over like a broken recording. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I did it. And if they linger too long, just a moment too long, they may feel it. A cold presence behind them, watching, waiting, whispering not just Elias's memories, but their own. Because once a lie is planted deep enough, it grows. And if you listen too closely, it may become yours. End.